Good afternoon. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the president of the Center for Security Policy. We are delighted to be sponsoring on short notice, but I think a very timely and topical presentation by several of the people who I think are most knowledgeable about and certainly most effective in communicating about the threat that is known as electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, and the various ways in which that pulse could afflict a nation like the United States, either man-caused or naturally occurring, and the repercussions of such an affliction. We're going to talk a bit about a very important and somewhat unexpected, but not unanticipated, development in the past few days that bears directly upon the man-caused piece of the problem, namely the interception in Panama of a vessel of North Korean operation that had in its hold some weaponry that might bear directly upon the threat of man-caused nuclear EMP. We'll be going through a sequence of presentations that will touch on that and the naturally occurring phenomenon. We'll also talk about how we can take steps, indeed how we believe we must take steps as quickly as possible to mitigate America's vulnerability, specifically the vulnerability of our electrical grid, upon which our entire society, of course, critically depends, to this phenomenon of electromagnetic pulse, however it is generated. I'm going to move through this batting order fairly quickly. It is a star-studded cast. We'll talk at the end a bit about what specifically is now in play on Capitol Hill as a remedy to this problem. We'll also talk about public opinion attitudes on the danger posed by EMP and the necessity of mitigating our vulnerability to it. And then finally, we'll announce the formation of a new coalition to try to help ensure that these corrective actions are taken, and taken as a matter of urgency, as we believe is appropriate. We're going to be hearing first from Dr. Peter Pry. Dr. Pry has a history of deep knowledge on matters involving nuclear and EMP-related threats. He served, among other things, as the executive director of the EMP Threat Commission, a blue ribbon, congressionally mandated study that over a number of years conclusively established the nature of the threat. He is currently the executive director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, and also a director of the United States Nuclear Strategy Forum, a man of considerable expertise, in part derived from his years in the intelligence community of the United States, as well as a professional staff member on Capitol Hill. I'm very pleased to have him here to address specifically this question of what the North Korean vessel had aboard it and what it might portend. With that, Peter Pry, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Frank. One of the nightmare scenarios the Congressional EMP Commission had was the possibility of a rogue state or terrorist group, and they specifically considered both Iran and North Korea when examining this threat, making an EMP attack against the United States by launching a primitive missile off of a freighter near the U.S. coast. What is an electromagnetic pulse? In EMP, think of it as super lightning, except its effects, instead of being on an area, on a point, can be in an area. When you detonate a nuclear weapon at high altitude, at 30 kilometers or more, it generates a super energetic radio wave that will destroy electronics potentially across a continental-sized area if the altitude is high enough. But even at the relatively lower altitudes, it basically can cause massive destruction of the electric grid and all the critical infrastructures that depend upon that. The communications, transportation, food, and water, the things that sustain our modern civilization and life itself, would collapse in the aftermath of an EMP nuclear attack. This can also be caused by the sun, by a solar flare that can generate something very similar to a nuclear EMP. Now, why are we here today? Because of our particular concerns about the North Korean freighter that was intercepted in Panama, the Chong Gang. You know, this North Korean flagged freighter with a North Korean crew, which resisted the boarding of it by the Panamanian authorities, and the captain attempted suicide rather than being boarded on preliminary examination, and the whole vessel hasn't been examined yet. They've only examined one cargo hold, 20%, and have already found 2 SA-2 missiles. These are admittedly old surface-to-air missiles, but they were designed to carry both conventional and nuclear warheads. They also are high-altitude missiles. They were used back in the 60s to take down Gary Francis Powers during the U-2 incident. They can reach an altitude of 20 to 35 kilometers, so they can reach the altitude for an EMP attack. They've got a slant range of about 40 miles, which means you could take a missile like this, put it in a freighter, stand off the coast, outside of our international territorial waters, and put an EMP attack over some place like New York City or Baltimore. The area of effect would reach 60 miles inland and probably collapse the eastern electric grid, which generates 70% of the electric power of the United States, which would have catastrophic consequences. The Congressional EMP Commission estimated that an attack like this, given our current state of unpreparedness, could kill up to 90% of the American population within a year from starvation, disease, and societal collapse. It's basically a high-tech means of killing people the old-fashioned way. Now, none of us are alleging that the purpose of the North Korean freighter was to do an EMP attack, or even that they were practicing this. In fact, they probably weren't. But it's extremely disturbing to find that we didn't even know that a freighter of a rogue state like North Korea actually had nuclear-capable missiles in its hold, 2 of them. And there were other dismantled parts within that hold, and we didn't even know about it. The Panamanians didn't stop them because they had direct knowledge of these missiles. They stopped them because the Chong Gang had a history of carrying drugs and arms to criminal organizations, and they apparently thought that they were going to find drugs aboard. Instead, they found, in effect, what could be a delivery system for a weapon of mass destruction. So it should give us pause that we have this sort of activity going on in our backyard, the Caribbean. These visits by North Korea and by Iranian freighters to countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba happen all the time, and we don't know what's going on. So it makes much more plausible the nightmare scenario that the EMP Commission raised, which is this idea of a foreign-flagged vessel, a freighter, rogue states or terrorists conducting a nuclear EMP attack that would have catastrophic consequences for the United States. I mean, everything was there except the nuclear weapons on the missile. Another thing I want to point out is, I'm amazed at how little reported this incident has been in the press. In fact, I only learned about it myself this morning. But on April 16th, an armed gang attacked a farm of transformers in San Jose, California with AK-47s and tried to take them out. They damaged 5 of the transformers. This made the local press, didn't make much of the national news, didn't make any as far as I can tell. And initially the local sheriff reported it as a sabotage attempt against these transformers. Subsequently the reporting has toned it down that it was vandalism with AK-47s. None of the transformers were destroyed, but 5 of them were damaged, and this alone was sufficient to cause them to put people to call for reduced electrical use in the San Jose area because of the damaged transformers. Now, if you put this together with what's been happening to our country, massive cyber attacks against our computer systems. Now you've got an armed gang, of some sort that made this attempt against these transformers, a physical sabotage attempt, and now a freighter carrying nuclear-capable missiles off of our coasts. One of the things the Commission found that's very important and that hasn't been widely understood by people, but people like R. James Woolsey in Congressional testimony have been trying to educate policymakers to this fact, is that cyber warfare in the doctrines of countries like Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran is not just about computer viruses. Their doctrine includes physical attacks like sabotage attempts against transformers and critical parts, and all the way up to nuclear EMP attack. That is considered part of cyber warfare doctrine by these guys. I would like to see the press, instead of maybe cooperating with an administration that seems to think the war on terrorism is over, to ask, what is there some larger significance to all of these seemingly unconnected events? These massive cyber attacks, this recent attempt at sabotage, the discovery of this freighter with these missiles. Is it possible that dry runs are being made for a larger operation, for an all-out cyber offensive that would include all of these elements? Computer viruses, sabotage against freighters, finally, an EMP nuclear attack? We see these things happening all around us, and yet nobody's asking Jay Carney, what does the president think about the significance of these missiles in this freighter, or this attempt on these transformers in California? A recent Lloyd's of London study, not looking at nuclear EMP attack, just looking at geographic storms, estimated that if only 10 to 20 transformers were destroyed in the Baltimore-Washington area, 10 to 20 transformers, it would put 40 to 80 million Americans in blackout, possibly for 2 years. For 2 years, just from the loss of 10 to 20 transformers. These guys with AK-47s tried to attack 10 transformers. I think we've got some questions here for Janet Napolitano and others in the Department of Homeland Security about what are they going to do to protect the transformers. I've probably taken up more of my time. I'll leave others to talk about what to do about it.
It's very important groundwork, though, Peter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank.
To talk a little bit more about the specific threat that Peter has described and that the EMP Commission considered sufficiently serious to recommend be addressed as a matter of utmost importance to the nation. From the South, we're very pleased to have with us Dr. Hank Cooper. Ambassador Cooper, among many other distinguished roles in our country's government, served as the director of the Strategic Defense Initiative under President George Herbert Walker Bush. He knows a lot about both missile threats and the state of our capabilities to both discern them and to correct them or counter them. He is, as they say, a rocket scientist. I'm very pleased to have him with us. Professor.
Thanks, Frank. I want to add just a point or two to what Peter said. Lloyd's of London also, in reports I saw, indicated that this particular vessel earlier this year had made stops in Russia and in China. And in my mind, the whole incident points to what I refer to as a cacophony of proliferation. And while we focused on North Korea and Iran are colleagues cooperating on nuclear testing and on ballistic missiles, and they both launch satellites, have launched in the past year, satellites over the South Pole, which, if they were carrying a nuclear weapon, were at just about the right altitude to be detonated over the center of the United States and potentially knock out the entire electric grid. So in the case of North Korea, perhaps our historic approach to things might deter them. Some might argue that. But in the case of Iran, we know they're ideologically committed to not only the destruction of Israel, the little Satan, but also the United States, the great Satan. And there's serious question as to whether or not the leaders of Iran would back away, and I'm assuming others will talk more about Iran, on the basis of being concerned about nuclear retaliation if they could kill, hundreds of millions of Americans, which is what is at stake with this EMP threat. Now, in the case of the threat from the South, there are two kinds of threats that I want to talk briefly about. You mentioned the EMP Commission. Even earlier than that, there was a threat commission that Don Rumsfeld chaired in the late 90s, which noted that threat missiles could be launched off of our coast. And they could be launched over the United States, and we had no defense about it. I don't know why Don didn't do anything about this during his term as the Secretary of Defense, but he didn't. We're just as vulnerable today as we were in the late 90s and during the time of the EMP Commission. except for a couple of possible alternatives that I want to talk a little bit more about. And the real hope, in my judgment, for doing anything in the near term lies with the Aegis missile defense system, ballistic missile defense system. As most of you, I assume, know, we now have deployed somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 or so ships, 16, I believe it is, in the Pacific, and they're going to grow to a similar number by 2015 in the Atlantic. And they're at sea around the world, and notably, a number of them are either in the ports or along the east coast of the United States, those in the Atlantic, which I've looked at recently. This is important because we now are aware that the single site in Alaska, while it provides some defense for those of us living on the East Coast, it's not terribly good against ICBMs over the East Coast. And those ships that are either in port or traveling on the East Coast could provide that defense if they get a cue from a radar up in our northeastern part of the United States. The ships that are currently deployed, and they've already been demonstrated to have a capability to intercept short, medium, intermediate range missiles, and they've also shot down a satellite, which is a point worth noting since one of the threats of concern is a satellite coming over the South Pole. The problems we have is there is no radar up in the northeastern part of the United States. What kind of radar would be required? Well, it's referred to as a TPY-2 radar. It's an X-band radar similar to what is deployed with our THAAD system, and it's like what will be deployed in Romania and Poland in 2015 and 2018, I guess it is, and operational by 2018. The defense systems that are currently on our ships today with that radar in Maine could defend the region between Washington and New York, for example. And what's on the ships would require an additional radar if it's to defend the southern part of the eastern seaboard, perhaps based in Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. But none of these ships operate in the Gulf of Mexico, which is, in my mind, the soft underbelly of the country. So there is nothing there to provide any defense against launches from off of ships or from Venezuela or from Cuba if you want to fold them into the mix. And that's a problem that needs to be dealt with, could be dealt with precisely the same kind of defense the American taxpayer is building, paying to bill, programmed, funded, as far as I know, to have operational in Romania in 2015 and in Poland by 2018. And when the Poland site is operational, there will be a missile for the standard missile replacement on the ship, which will be more capable, and that missile, with a single radar in the Northeast, could defend the entire United States east of the Mississippi. If we spend the right kind of money on building a lightweight kill vehicle, you could defend the entire United States from ships off our coast. How possible is this? Many people say you can't do that because the Navy won't stand for picket ships. Last year, on an average day, if you go look through the data, we had 2 ships on the East Coast on an average day, and something between 3 and 6 ships either in port or in maintenance cycle. Those numbers will go up in the coming months because of the modernization cycle that's underway. With respect to looking south and getting an early cue, if you study the radar fans that are produced, and these pictures are out in the handouts, and thanks to Peter Huessy, there are radar fans that were a legacy of the Cold War warning systems we had for missiles that would come over the North Pole. And notably missing is a fan headed south. If you could put a radar in the Panama City, Florida area to fill that gap. It's hard to see because most of the rest of the picture is covered. That's not sufficient to provide the Aegis capability, but it is important to internet the radars around the world to provide early cueing information and track information to enable the defense. So if you put those things together, though, with the Aegis Ashore site at several military bases around the Gulf of Mexico, we could close this gap with respect to the to the missile threat. I think it's important, I want to say this, and I don't want to dwell on it because others will be dealing with it. Missile defense is not going to help you with the threat from the sun. And it's important to deal with the grid. And if we deal with the grid, that also is very important in dealing with the missile defense threat, because the threat of an EMP burst 200 miles up doesn't kill people on the ground. It turns out the lights. It turns out everything else, essentially, that we deal with. But if we're able to turn them on again, if the electric power grid can be restated, replaced, the transformers can survive this attack, then we can come back. We can survive. And so I'm very much in favor of the grid, the SHIELD Act. Missile defense is important, but it's not sufficient.
Dr. Cooper, thank you very much. Next, we're going to hear from a woman who has devoted much of her life of late to understanding a problem that the ambassador referred to. She previously was a career intelligence officer in the Central Intelligence Agency, but she has become one of the country's real authorities, I think, on what is happening in Iran at the moment. And we want to stitch this together, as Dr. Cooper indicated, the joining at the hip of Iran with North Korea and what that might specifically mean with respect to this EMP threat. Clare Lopez, welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. And that point, Frank, that you just mentioned, the joining together at the hip of Iran and North Korea is what I want to talk about a little bit today here, and the very real threat that what I like to call joint venture between these two poses to the United States and our national security. As both Dr. Pry and Ambassador Cooper mentioned, North Korea and Iran are working together not just on missiles and a missile delivery capability, but also on everything that goes with it, the warheads and what the warheads would contain, meaning a nuclear warhead. Now, Iran and North Korea as well also work very closely together on a biological weapons program. It's not the topic for today, but just to mention that this is also another kind of a warhead threat that would be included and certainly remains in the arsenal of both Iran and North Korea in terms of these missiles. So in terms of Iran, let's begin with Iran. And if you go back to about November of 2011, which is when the current new Secretary General, new at that time, Yukiya Amano, took the place of the previous Secretary General of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and very quickly issued a report in November 2011 that was more candid and more filled with details about Iran's nuclear program than had been seen prior to that. He and the IAEA quite frankly discussed the full range of Iran's program. They talked about various sites, Natanz for one, which has been revealed now for quite a number of years and is the primary centrifuge facility for Iran, the place where enrichment activities take place. But it's not the only place that enrichment activities take place, and this is a key. The fact that Natanz, for instance, along with other sites like Isfahan, which is the conversion facility for Iran, and other places, were revealed by an opposition group. An Iranian opposition group is the ones that brought this to the attention of the public and of the IAEA. Perhaps the intelligence communities around the world knew more about it, but publicly the information was disclosed for the first time in August of 2002. And so the fact that these places were revealed for the first time indicated that Iran had been, for the previous at least 12, 14 years, been conducting a clandestine, a covert, nuclear weapons development program. I think that's significant because we need to consider that as their modus operandi to this day. They continue to operate a clandestine program. So when that IAEA report came out in 2011, it talked about the places that are known, the places that are now in the public venue, the public domain, if you will, like Natanz, like Isfahan. But it also talked about the fact that Iran was continuing to disregard United Nations resolutions about stopping its nuclear enrichment, and the fact that sanction after sanction after sanction has been applied to Iran by the United Nations, by the United States, and other allied governments in the West and around the world, because Iran fails continuously to comply with those resolutions that it must stop nuclear enrichment at places like Natanz. Now, the problem is that there are other facilities, as we talked about, clandestine facilities that are coming to light. Even just in this past year, we have had revelations from Iranian opposition and from penetrations from inside of Iran, inside of the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the organization within Iran that has the responsibility for all of Iran's WMD programs and also its ballistic missile program. Sites at a place called Fordow have been revealed in recent times, in recent years. Fordow, built deeply inside of a bunker, down under a mountain, clearly built that way for protection against potential military strike against that facility. That place, Fordow, supposedly to hold thousands of centrifuges and to be another enrichment site for Iran. Now, Fordow was hit with an explosion inside the mountain in January of this year. The IAEA, for whatever reason, has not addressed that, and they have not been on site to inspect Fordow since last year in December. It is a bit odd to me to realize this, but the IAEA actually relies on questionnaires, written questionnaires from Iran to update the IAEA on its quarterly reports as to where the Iranian program is at. Another site that recently has been revealed is a place called Kondab, again, built into a bunker underneath a mountain. The Quds site. Quds in Arabic, of course, means Jerusalem. It has significance when a country like Iran uses that name. The Quds site is an extensive site, about 15 miles or so from Fordow. It is built to hold around 8,000 centrifuges, according to reports coming out. There is another site called the Martyr Mughniya site. Mughniya, named after Imad Mughniya, the primary terror chieftain for Hezbollah that worked for Iran and worked for al-Qaeda for so many decades. This site looks to be a missile defense site. It is an in-ground missile silo site where Shahab 3s are based. It is a defensive site. And what it is protecting is not yet clear, but the Iranians are very clearly protecting these different nuclear weapons facility sites. Now, the other point about the IAEA reports that I want to mention is that it talks about other ongoing activities in addition to enrichment at sites like these. It's talking about the development of nuclear warheads, talking about fitting a warhead to the nose cone of a missile. This is probably the last and the most, maybe not the most difficult, but one of the last most difficult steps in actually weaponizing a missile and a warhead, marrying them together. This kind of activity has been reported by the IAEA to be going on in some of the Iranian sites. So these are the kinds of things that we're seeing in the IAEA reports, which are available online and freely available to look at. There is a progression, I would say, in these years since 2011, and this is a time when we might remember that sanctions, international sanctions by the IAEA or by the United Nations, the United States and others have increased and become ever more oppressive, really, to the Iranian economy, and yet it is precisely in this time period when we see the Iranian nuclear weapons program actually accelerating. And I would suggest to you that that acceleration is a response to sanctions, at least in some part. believing that the sanctions would become more onerous, more difficult for the economy. I think it is probably human nature that the Iranian regime doubles down and speeds up to get to wherever it intends to go with its nuclear weapons program, and that is what we're seeing as an outcome, I think, of these sanctions. Last mention quickly about Iran's missile program, because this is so closely tied to the North Koreans. Iran is advancing with North Korean assistance and both its range and its accuracy. It has multi-stage missiles. It has also missiles that have moved on from liquid fuel propellant to solid rocket fuel propellant, which also not only assists in the range, but it also assists in the disguising of an attempt at a launch, because you can more quickly load a missile with solid rocket fuel propellant at the last minute, whereas liquid fueling takes longer and is more exposed in the open for a longer period of time. The Shahab 3 missile series certainly is expanding in its capability and range. The Sijil is an outgrowth of the Shahab 3 missile. It uses solid fuel rocket propellant, currently with a range, reported range anyway, of 2,000 kilometers, as with the Shahab 3 missile too. The Fateh 110 missile is also advancing in capability. It recently has reported to have had added a heat seeker capability to improve its accuracy from land to sea, targets being from shore to ship. These, by the way, were the missiles reportedly taken out in an Israeli strike near the Syrian border not long ago, earlier this year in 2013. In any case, then, all of these missiles and others being worked together between Iran and North Korea, the capability is advancing. Why does Iran need 2,000-kilometer and above intercontinental ballistic missile, which the Pentagon's new annual report on Iranian capabilities recently again came out this year, as with last year's report, saying that by 2015, Iran's ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, will have the capability of reaching the United States. Why does Iran need that capability? It already covers, its missile capability covers the entire Middle East. So I will close with that and talk then, just leave you with the last thought that the Iranian and North Korean partnership is accelerating the capabilities in both nuclear warhead and in missile delivery systems. This is a very dangerous development that needs to be monitored.
Clare Lopez, thank you very much. Just 2 points of my own on this. One is, if, as Peter Pry, among others, have discussed, the North Koreans have managed to acquire from the Russians, or perhaps other sources, optimized nuclear weapons for EMP effect, it is almost certainly the case that the Iranians will be benefiting from the transfer of that technology. And we mustn't forget something that the outgoing President Mohammad Ahmadinejad has repeatedly said, namely that a world without America is not only desirable, it is achievable. And I think our view is that that may be an indication that what he has in mind here is a nuclear EMP to achieve that goal. Next, we're very pleased to have with us, though we weren't entirely sure he was going to be able to make it, but through superhuman effort, as we expect from him, Michael Del Rosso has indeed joined our panel. Michael is a man with a deep knowledge of technology and information technology in particular, having worked with Fortune 500 companies in the past in both developing their capabilities and understanding threats to their technology and information technology. Among other distinctions, Michael Del Rosso worked with Peter Pry on the EMP Threat Commission, and he served formerly as the chairman of the very important committee on critical infrastructure protection of the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers in the USA. He is a fellow, I'm delighted to say, senior fellow of the Center for Security Policy and also the Claremont Institute. And we've asked Michael to just flesh out, in addition to these various man-induced electromagnetic pulse threats, a naturally occurring phenomenon and what it might in turn mean for our critical infrastructure and our society. Michael, welcome.
Thank you. There's a phenomenon of a coronal mass ejection where large amounts of plasma, or the corona of the sun, are ejected. And if they hit the Earth's geomagnetic field, they produce a significant electromagnetic pulse. And the first time this was observed on a large scale was in 1859 in a storm known as the Carrington event, which a NASA report described as those who witnessed this flare, that it electrified transmission cables of telegraph lines, set fires in telegraph offices, and produced northern lights so bright that people could read newspapers in the middle of the night by the red and green glows of the aurora borealis, which moved down toward the equator. For days, you could send transmissions on telegraph lines without the batteries connected. And they had to be removed, otherwise they would catch fire. If an event like that happened today, it would probably bring down the entire grid. In fact, just last July, there was a coronal mass ejection of a similar stature to the Carrington event that missed the Earth by just 1 week. It passed right through our orbit a week after the planet went through it, and if it had actually hit us, we'd have a much different conversation here right now. There's been no less than 5...
Or no conversation right here, right now.
This would be dead. There's been no less than 5 blue ribbon commissions of the U.S. government that have looked at this and deem it to be a credible event. Just last 2.5 years ago, in February, a number of colleagues all co-submitted a petition to the Federal Electric Regulatory Commission and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, led by Tom Popek, an engineer at the Foundation for Resilient Societies. And we focused on just one specific issue in that petition. We said, hey, there is a 1990 NERC memo that says if there was ever a prolonged power outage from a geomagnetic storm, that the backup power that keeps the spent fuel at nuclear reactors from overheating might not have the resiliency to maintain those cooling effects, and you would end up seeing the spent fuel, which is not in containment, burst into flames and generating a great radiation disaster. Well, a few weeks later, tragically, that's exactly what happened in Japan. A earthquake took down the primary grid, and a tsunami took down the backup power. And the significant radiation leaks you saw and the explosion that took the roof off the Fukushima power plant, which was just back in the news, that was not the power generating reactors, which suffered damage but were in significant containment vessels of multiple feet of concrete and steel. That was the uncontained spent fuel. Once the circulation cooling water ceased, it boiled off. The zirconium encrusting of the uranium hexafluoride fuel burst into flames. It's an exothermic reaction. It's like a thermite bomb. You can't extinguish it. And you have appreciable radiation leaks that I've seen estimates that the cost of it is north of $250 billion. Now, meanwhile, the resiliency of adding resiliency to those power backup generators for tsunami is really an insignificant amount. And in fact, there's monuments throughout Japan on hillsides that are centuries old that warn, don't build houses lower than this. So with a little prudence, someone might have said, perhaps we should make these a bit more resilient. Likewise, if there was ever an appreciable outage, which a geomagnetic storm would produce, you'd have a very critical situation at the 60 or so sites where the spent fuel from the 104 operational nuclear reactors are currently stored without containment in the United States. The cost estimates, there was a National Academy of Science study, and it was looking at the effects of a geomagnetic storm that was 1/10 of a Carrington event, which the last time one occurred was 154 years ago. And by the way, they think the period of occurrence of this is anywhere from 150 to up to 300 or 500 years. So we're actually in the window where the best science available says you run a probability of about 1% a year of having a similar event. Well, they looked at a 1921 geomagnetic storm for which we have more data that at the time took down all the electric switching systems of the Penn Central Railroad, amongst other things. And they felt that in their estimates that you would have an expense of up to $2 trillion in the first year alone to remediate the damage. and that would be caused by this, and you'd have prolonged outages from 4 to 10 years. And you'd have many millions of people, tens of millions of people without power. And needless to say, you cannot have tens or hundreds of millions of people without power for an extended period of time without expecting millions of deaths. In fact, when Dr. Graham testified, he was the commissioner of the the chairman of the EMP Commission, and in fact was President Ronald Reagan's science advisor. If a nuclear EMP laydown occurs and takes the grid and the associated electronics down, in the first 12 to 18 months from privation, the lack of all the infrastructure that is electronic and electrical in nature, you'd have hundreds of millions of deaths in the United States. Because you wouldn't be able to sustain the population. So in the short run, just a threat from a geomagnetic storm, which can occur tomorrow, which it's not based on any human intent. It's just a fact of nature. And as I said, no less than 5 official government studies say it's a probable event. And in fact, the recent Lloyd's of London study, independent, said that it's almost inevitable, and that the outages would be substantial, take years to repair. Now, one of the things to note, too, is that the reason why it would cause such damage is because there's a North American bulk transmission system across the United States that has from 500 to 1,000, however you want to categorize them, large transformers. The United States manufactures less than 20% of the transformers that they need to support the ongoing maintenance and sustainment of this bulk transmission grid. So over 80% come from foreign sources. The lead time is 1 to 2 years to get a replacement transformer. There's high quality copper and steel that needs to be manufactured at lead times, and they weigh up to 400 tons. So on a good day, it's a logistical problem to replace them. A bad critical transformers from something that the National Academy of Sciences says would cost trillions of dollars to repair and replace over periods of years. And it's inexcusable that the maintainers of this infrastructure, let alone the Department of Homeland Security, which is statutorily responsible for protecting the critical infrastructure, has taken no action on this. We recently had a stimulus package of $865 billion with a B that included such efforts as building tunnels under highways for turtles, but for a mere fraction of a percent, that money could have been allocated if the people whose job it was, the people who actually draw a paycheck and are responsible for keeping us safe, did something about it. And these people, as the public is aware, have been giving all of these reports from these 5 Blue Ribbon Commissions. They've been given specific recommendations from the EMP Commission that the Department of Homeland Security has, and they've not acted on a single one of them. And so right now there's legislation that Representative Trent Franks introduced about a month ago, H.R. 2417, the SHIELD Act, that would start the process of actually having empowering the FERC to take a look at the national grid and to take the steps necessary to secure it. And it's inexcusable for a nation with the wealth and the economy that we have that the insignificant funds necessary to protect what has been deemed inevitable are not being expended to keep the population safe.
Michael, thank you very much. You've given us the perfect segue to our next speaker, Peter Huessy. Peter is one of this city's preeminent national security thought leaders and networkers. He convenes with great regularity events featuring those who are really at the cutting edge of the national security policy debate in government functions around this town and from elsewhere around the world. He is the president of Geostrategic Analysis and a man who has been deeply involved in the effort to secure enactment of legislation now called the SHIELD Act, as Michael mentioned, H.R. 2417. And we've invited him to come and talk a little bit about that act and the imperative of addressing its passage. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, very much. Hi, I'm Peter Huessy, and I want to thank you all for being here today. The SHIELD Act has been introduced. It's before the Energy and Commerce Committee as 22 co-sponsors. But I think what's important is the 2 top co-sponsors. Yvette Clarke is the Secretary of the Black Caucus in the U.S. Congress. She represents a district in New York City. And Trent Franks represents district in Arizona. And I think voting record-wise, they probably are on the opposite ends of the poll in the U.S. Congress. One of the more liberal members and also one of probably the most conservative member. But they are co-chairman of the EMP caucus. And Yvette Clark and Trent Franks have talked on this quite a bit. Let me tell you what it does. But before that, let me tell you some of the things you're hearing from the arms control community that you don't need to do this. The first thing they say is Iran, for example, the sanctions will work or we'll make a deal. I don't know if you saw Shoshana Bryan, who's with the Jewish Policy Center. An interesting article is the Iranians sued in the European Union in court to demand that the European Union reveal the information they have to determine that Iran is not in compliance with the IAEA. Of course, in order to take that material and put it on the table, the Iranians would know what we know about their nuclear program. They would know how then to shut off that access and that information. And unfortunately is the EU courts have now sided with the Iranians. Second issue is we hear about a recent story said the North Koreans have slowed down the building of a facility to launch ballistic missiles. What they don't point out is all along the Chinese border are tunnels built specifically for the deployment of ballistic missiles, which the North Koreans put in there in order to, I think, make it look as if the launches might be coming from China, which means we would be less willing to perhaps retaliate. So the idea that you can either do negotiations or sanctions to solve this problem with respect to the ballistic missile launch of an EMP attack, I think you're barking up the wrong tree. But the problem is the sun won't negotiate, and the sun, you can't tell it to, change its view. And that is why you need a SHIELD Act for the solar EMP. But within the solution to that is the solution to the nuclear program. Let me explain what I mean. The SHIELD Act requires the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to get from the utilities a proposal on protecting the grid from EMP solar. It cannot be a protection that just means we're going to change the way we run things. It has to be a technology insertion, because that's the only way you're going to deal with the EMP solar effects that actually happen every day. They're just not as bad as you may think of the Carrington effect, or one that back in the 1800s. So every day they get hit, and FERC will get that proposal from the electrical grid, and then FERC will say either yes or no or amend it. And they can amend it and change it and send it back to NERC and say this is what you have to do. And as I said, the key is it has to be a technology insertion. Now, as my colleague just mentioned, there are a number of vendors that have developed a technology to deal with this, and one of them sent the material out to it's the size of a semi 18-wheeler, sent it out to the Idaho National Lab, and they used their money, and DTRA, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, also used their money, and for $2 million they did a test last October. They found out not only does the gizmo, as I call it, work and work well, instead of protecting one transformer, it will protect up to 4 transformers in a cluster. Even though all transformers are not in a cluster, if you take the $200,000 cost for the largest gizmo and apply that to the 3,000 to 5,000 total transformers you have in America, you're coming out to a cost of roughly, I average it around $600 million one-time cost. Now, this is the key. The government doesn't have to spend any money, don't have to increase rates, don't have to go to the public utility commissions. The fact is that every day the utilities have to pay for EMP because they have to power down the utilities when they get the solar flux that comes on them every day. When we first asked NERC, we said, what do you spend every year on buying energy at the margin because your conditional sources you have to power down? They said millions of dollars. We said, how much? And after a while, they said at least a couple $100 million a year. Now, they sell $400+ billion worth of electricity a year. So a couple $100 million is a lot of money for you and I, but for the utility industry, it's kind of below the 1% level. But if you can save every year $100 to $200 million in electricity generation costs and use that money to pay for, let's say, $600 million, that means in 3 years, investors could get 33% a year return on their investment, which I don't know anybody in America and Wall Street who wouldn't say, I'll issue $10,000 bonds, pay for it, redo it, and then what happens after 3 years? You use that money to pay for the additional gizmos you need to protect against nuclear EMP, which will cost you probably, as Peter Price pointed out and the EMP Commission has put out in his own book, is probably in the $1 to $2 billion thing, which means over 5 to 10 years you pay for that. The bill is passed unanimously, I believe it was 2 years ago, in the House. Not a single no vote. The problem in the Senate was the view between some members said FERC has the capability to go order the utilities to do this already, and others saying that no, you should put it in the cyber bill, and once you put it in the cyber bill, as you know, the cyber bill didn't go anywhere because of some difficulties. So as Trent Franks has said, we need to have a separate bill. We need to pass it, and as my colleague said, it is unconscionable that even if you put this in the rate base, you're talking about 12 cents per person per year, one time, to pay for a fix with respect to solar EMP. If you do nuclear, multiply by 4, 50 cents per person per year for 1 year to fix this. And a lot of people say that those of us in this business, gin up problems in order to make money. As I pointed out, you can do this and not have the government pay 1 nickel, not have ratepayers pay 1 nickel, not have the utilities have to spend any money, but investors who would protect our national security, do this in a quick period of time with American technology that is now available, and protect us from a very serious problem. Thanks.
Peter, thank you. To establish some sense of sort of the level of awareness of this problem among the public and their response to it as they learn about it, and we're delighted to have you with us. Steve, over to you.
Thank you. So as Frank mentioned, he reached out to my boss, Kellyanne Conway, and I as a strategic partner, specifically on the SHIELD Act itself, and to just gauge a baseline test of American support. So we went into this project looking to answer 3 basic questions. Number 1, do the American people support this legislation? Number 2, can the American people understand what the SHIELD Act would do and an EMP attack? And question 3, do the American people care about this at all? And I'm very pleased to announce that the answer to all 3 of those questions is a very affirmative yes. We started out asking a simplified version of what the SHIELD Act would do. We asked if they would oppose or favor a law to install devices on the national power grid to protect against an electromagnetic pulse. We gave them no additional context, no additional information. This resembles the type of description that you might hear on the local news or read about in the newspaper when discussing this issue. We got 48% in support of this legislation, only 29% opposed, an additional 23% who admitted that they just couldn't form an opinion and didn't know. But the 48% is very significant. It's nearly majority. Certainly it's a strong plurality of support with very little to go on that Americans are behind this. Importantly, as mentioned, Yvette Clarke and Trent Franks are the 2 main co-sponsors of this legislation, and fittingly, we found that both Republicans and Democrats, a majority of each, support this bill nationwide. Independents actually were the ones who were the least in favor of it, at least initially. We gave them more detail. We gave them a brief description that went more into what the devices would do and what an EMP attack might look like, and just a brief, a toe in the water of the consequences of an EMP attack. And giving them just a minimal amount of description, maybe 2.5 sentences at most, support for the SHIELD Act rose from 48 to 70% among all Americans. It obviously increased in all 3 parties, Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, but it moved Independents from initially opposing the SHIELD Act to supporting with nearly 60% support, and then Republicans and Democrats each way above 70% support. And that tells us, as pollsters, we don't do a lot of issues that have equal support on both the left and the right, which leads to the conclusion that this is not a left to right issue. In fact, this is not a political partisan issue. It's a national security issue. We would up here say a necessity, and the American people agree with that. 70% is a very large, supermajority of Americans who support this. More importantly, at least in my opinion, is the amount of people who say that they don't know. As I mentioned in the first question, we gave them very little context, and 23% said don't know. We gave them just a little bit more of information. A paragraph at most, some would classify it as less than a paragraph. The amount of people who said that they don't know drops from 23% to 8%. With just a little bit amount of information, 92% of Americans formed an opinion on this issue. And I think that's very telling when you hear some people may say that this is a debate that can only happen in the halls of Congress or in the halls of state legislatures across the country. I very much believe that this is a debate that can and should happen nationwide, directly with the American people and the voters and citizens of this country. It is certainly an issue that could potentially impact everybody. Finally, giving them the information that we did, gauging their support on it, we asked them to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 how important that they believe it is that Congress take action on this issue. Also very pleased to announce that the mean out of a scale of 1 to 10 was 7.2. But more importantly, when you break it down into the groups, when we ask a scale 1 to 10 question, we look at three things. The first is the top 3 boxes, and that indicates intensity. Not only is it important, it's very important. We look at the bottom 3 boxes. That would be 1 to 3 on the scale of 1 to 10, and that indicates intensity in the opposite direction. People don't believe it's important at all. And then finally, in the middle group is just right there in the middle. What we did is we took the top 3 boxes for intensity, very important. Then we looked at everything 5 and over, and we to indicate somewhat important. What we found is nationwide, 51% of the American people believe that it's very important that Congress take action on this issue. Additional 19, making it an even 70, are 5 or above. So the American people support it, they understand it, and then this is telling is that they believe that Congress needs to take action on it. And finally, some of the key demographics that we looked at that were most in favor of Congress taking action, very prevalent among African Americans, Hispanics, women, and then finally among the party breaks I mentioned before, this is not a political issue. We also found it very telling that among Republicans, Democrats, and Independents, the mean for all of them was the same, 7.2. This is a tripartisan agreement that Congress needs to do this.
Steve, thank you very much. This survey, I think, surpassed my expectations, to be honest with you. Not altogether surprising given the stakes and given the common sense of the American people. But what it does certainly do, now that we've got this data in hand, is reinforce the need for the sorts of actions that you've heard talked about here today. To that end, we have helped pull together with the leadership of our speakers today and many others, an informal ad hoc EMP coalition. And I'm very pleased to announce that it has now as its 2 honorary co-chairmen, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich and former Director of Central Intelligence Jim Woolsey, reflecting, as does this data, the bipartisanship or tripartisanship, if you will, that I think needs to be brought to bear in connection with this threat. Because if the lights go out, if the critical infrastructure fails, if the casualties are as we believe they must be, given our dependence as a society on electricity, it won't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent or a non-voter. You will be adversely affected, probably in the extreme. The purpose of this coalition, and we have just the first founding members of it listed here in a handout for you. I anticipate we will have many more over the next few weeks as we build out this effort to build on the great work that has been done by some of the organizations represented here and individuals like them elsewhere who are already hard at work on the various aspects of this challenge, identifying the threat, man-caused and naturally occurring, raising awareness about it, identifying the steps that could mitigate it, promoting the corrective actions that will make those steps practical and adopted, and not least, of course, doing that with all of the various, as they are fond of calling it here in Washington, stakeholders at the government level, among the media, among the public at large. And to do so in a way that actually will translate not into yet another study, not into further extended, even sometimes it seems endless, certainly inconclusive debate, but actually the necessary steps to correct especially the critical vulnerabilities, the yawning vulnerabilities that several of our colleagues have talked about with respect to the very backbone of our electrical grid, the transformers. So watch this space for more. I would commend to you, if you'd like more information right away on any of the issues that we've talked about. Several of our partner organizations under the coalition have got some terrific resources. I would include among them Impact America. Their website is impactamerica.org, .com, probably .org too. The Electric Infrastructure Security Council, which is at eiscouncil.org. High Frontier, Hank Cooper's terrific organization, the center's securefreedom.org as another that we would commend to you to both learn more, to be equipped with the necessary information to help extend the universe of people who are aware of this problem and to enlist them in the corrective actions that are needed. We need your help. We would welcome it, and needless to say, the time is at hand where it needs to be brought to bear. I want to particularly thank, as I think Michael did, our colleagues on the Hill, Peter as well, who have taken the lead on this. Former Congressman Roscoe Bartlett, Peter's old boss, was instrumental in this over many years. The baton is really passed now to Congressman Trent Franks and to Yvette Clarke, and we're hoping that we will shortly have senators who are stepping up to do the same on the Senate side. But this is a moment when we must come together. The EMP coalition is intended to try to help advance that with the very strong involvement and leadership of their partners. Let me just close by noting that our next important event in this continuing effort to elevate the EMP issue will be featuring Jim Woolsey, honorary co-chairman of the coalition, and Dr. Peter Pry, where they will be speaking at the American Center for Democracy at 600 Pennsylvania Avenue on the 29th of this month at 6 o'clock? 5 o'clock. Hank Cooper, actually, I keep forgetting this. There are several others that are going to be involved in this. Bill Fortune, the author of 1 Second After, a terrific and very, very accessible way to get an understanding of this problem, also a partner in this coalition. So with that, please take note of this event. We will have others that we will try to keep you apprised of. We would be happy if there are questions to take them. If you would identify who you'd like to have take them, that will help. If not, you'll just find whoever is moved to do so will. Yes, sir. Could you identify yourself, please?
With Voice of America. I have a little bit of a follow-up question about the so-called nightmare scenario related to North Korea. If
Sure.
that happens, I think the primary assumptions that we must have is North Korea, number one, have a workable nuclear warhead that can be put on their short-range or medium-range missiles. I wonder if we are sure about it. Number two is their ship should not be detected by any intelligence or U.S. authority up, all the way to the point where they conduct this nightmare EMP attack. How probable that kind of situation is?
Peter, do you want to start?
First,
Take
the
mic.
official the administration's official assessment is that North Korea does not yet have nuclear missile warheads. In this respect, however, it's at variance with its own Pentagon Defense Intelligence Agency assessment, which is that the Nodong medium-range ballistic missile currently is armed with nuclear warheads. This is a medium-range missile, not just a short-range missile. Moreover, the Congressional EMP Commission, and I think that may be a conservative, cautious estimate. The Congressional EMP Commission on which I served assessed that they probably had what Frank had referred to earlier as super EMP warheads, because we were demarched by Russian generals when the commission was meeting to warn that technology had leaked from Russia to North Korea to develop these enhanced EMP weapons. These weapons are nuclear weapons of special design. They're not designed to make a big explosion. They're designed to produce gamma rays. And so their characteristic is that they have a very low yield. Mind you, North Korea has conducted 3 nuclear tests already, and all of those tests are consistent with the design of a super EMP warhead. All of them had extremely low yields. The yields, in fact, were less than 10 kilotons, on the order of just a few kilotons, which is, again, consistent with a weapon of a very low yield. The nominal yield that you would normally get from a first-generation nuclear weapon would be 10 or 20 kilotons. It's actually harder to build a nuclear weapon that produces these very low yields, and to do it right off the bat. So, moreover, there was testimony, or independently of the EMP Commission, subsequent to our analysis, South Korean military intelligence came to the same conclusion, that Russians were in North Korea helping them develop super EMP weapons. And then in 2012, last year, a Chinese military commentator said North Korea has super EMP warheads. The reason I emphasize that so much is the super EMP warhead is a even much greater threat than just a normal nuclear weapon of conventional design. But more than that, one of the characteristics of a super EMP warhead is that they're very light. Their design is very small. They would resemble in design a neutron bomb, for example. And in the Cold War, the United States built a neutron warhead, a W-84, that weighed less than 50 kilograms. Now, the so-called space launch vehicle that North Korea tested in December 2012 delivered a satellite weighing over 200 kilograms. So if they have a super EMP warhead, that means that it's not 2015 that we're looking at a threat to the United States from a nuclear attack, a nuclear EMP attack from North Korea, that they could do it right now. They could do it right now by means of their space launch vehicle, and they could do it the way Ambassador Cooper was warning, by coming from the south. The design of this so-called space launch vehicle actually closely resembles another Russian secret weapon, which was called a fractional orbital bombardment system. It's basically an ICBM disguised to look like a space launch vehicle that has unlimited range, because it could, in the case of what the Russians were planning to do in the Cold War, was deliver a warhead like a satellite, putting it on a southward orbit that would pass over the South Pole, and then approach the United States from the south, and then do an EMP detonation over us when it hit us from that direction. Why the south? Because we don't have any ballistic missile early warning radars or interceptors facing south. We're blind and defenseless from that direction. That's what they planned to do in the Cold War. And then when the North Koreans launched their missile in December, their space launch vehicle in December, it practiced that very orbit, going over the South Pole, approaching the United States from the south, though they were careful not to orbit the satellite over U.S. territory. Iran has done the same thing. Those North Korean technicians that are in Iran, they help the Iranians build their space launch vehicle. They're helping the Iranians develop their space launch center. They've conducted 3 launches exactly like that. And those satellites, by the way, both the North Korean satellites and the Iranian satellites, all were orbited at an altitude that is consistent with placing an electromagnetic field over all 48 contiguous United States. If that was a warhead and not a satellite, and it detonated at the altitude on the trajectory that all 4 of those satellites were launched on, it could put an EMP field over the whole United States. So there is evidence too. And one last thing, when it comes to these assessments, well, who should we believe? The administration? How close are the North Koreans to a nuclear warhead threat? Former CIA Director Woolsey, back in January 1994, testified then to the Senate Armed Services Committee that North Korea already had nuclear weapons in 1994. That was 19 years ago. They've been working on their nuclear weapons, perfecting them, developing them ever since. What does it take? 19 years. What could they be building for 19 years, to improve those first nuclear weapons they came up with in 1994? Have this in mind as a metric. The first nuclear weapons ever built were built by the United States in the Manhattan Project. It took us 3 years to build 2 nuclear weapons of completely different design when it was just a theoretical possibility and no one would even know it would work. 3 years using 1930s and 1940s era technology. What could North Korea do using 21st century technology with help from Russia, China, other countries? 19 years. Thank you.
Claire?
I wanted to add very quickly in terms of, and even more simple, and in terms of the proximity and the simplicity of delivering such a weapon possibly to the United States. Think about the very close relationship that Iran has developed together with Venezuela, among other countries in South America, but Venezuela in particular, being the northernmost country of South America. There are reports that the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, has been already building a missile in-ground silo missile site on the northern Paraguay Peninsula of Venezuela. And there are reports as well in the media, Die Welt for sure, that Shahab 3s already have been seen inside of Venezuela. That missile launch site, Paraguay Peninsula, not yet operational. But think of that as a possibility. You don't even need an ICBM launch. If the Shahab 3, whose minimum range is less than, in the range of 1,800 kilometers, that gets it to Florida. And that's just its minimum range.
Yeah. Hank, would you speak, if you can, to the second question, which was how probable is it we wouldn't see this coming?
Well, just an observation or two. You don't need a big ship to put an erector launcher on board. You need something somewhat larger than the erector launcher. You were talking about a short or a medium-range missile. So practically, I think it's maybe bigger than a yacht, but not so big as a vessel of the sort you're thinking about. And there are tens of thousands of them that are off our coast all the time. So you can play the statistical game if you wish. I think that there's no comfort in believing that the Coast Guard or whoever, you pick who you want, the Navy or somebody, would have high confidence in picking up this kind of a threat off of coast.
And part of the reason why we're here is to talk about the fact that this particular North Korean vessel, as an example, had what could be platforms for this kind of thing in its hold, unbeknownst to our intelligence services and so on.
Allegedly sugar and drugs, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Peter, did you have something? Peter, we're going to just have to take another question. Did you have something on this that hadn't been said? Okay, good.
Our Navy has the capability of seeing a great deal of the ocean, but they don't, unless they have intelligence, they don't go follow freighters. And there are thousands of them out there in the ocean. They generally follow a normal pattern. You'd have to be very close because they could launch the thing and sink it. And the jihadis could go get 72 mermaids and they'd be perfectly happy.
Or at least dead. Any other questions?
Well, one more thing, just to say on that, a container ship is optimum for this because a container can be the erector launcher. Ask someone how many container ships go up and down our East Coast and into the Gulf of Mexico, and you get some idea of the numbers.
And if I'm not mistaken, Ambassador Cooper, the Russians are marketing
Yeah,
a
they market
launcher
such a
system
thing.
in a container. Is that
They
right?
do,
Yeah,
indeed.
it's called the K Club container missile launch system, and it's already being sold by the Russians.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I'd just like to make a comment. I'm Craig Glazer. I'm actually from PJM Interconnection. We are the electric grid operator in 13-state region, including the District of Columbia. And I just a comment, but I want to go to the more issue on the solar flares, GMD. Just people can argue about whether enough has been done, but I am concerned about the characterization Mr. Rosso had that nothing has been done in this area. To be honest, that's just factually inaccurate. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission just recently used its regulatory powers in Congress, which are considerable, to direct the industry to both deal with the issue of solar flares and protection of devices, both from an operational point of view as well as from developing and implementing specific protection plans. So we can talk about, whether it's enough or not, but I just wouldn't want to leave a characterization I think is inaccurate to say nothing has been done in this area of the industry.
I apologize, I didn't want to give that impression. I would add, too, there's operators like Centerpoint Energy in Houston, Texas, that have taken this very seriously, and without any federal direction, just knowing that this is a threat, they've actually been evaluating and remediating their infrastructure.
As have we in PJM.
Mention
Right.
Maine. Mention Maine.
And there's legislation in Maine that has actually been enacted in law. I mean, I could go
Michael.
on. I wasn't trying to oversimplify it, but I was just trying to be brief, and I didn't mean to give that impression.
Peter Huessy, and then we'll come to you, Peter.
I would just point out, no utility has taken a technologically implemented protection of the grid against a massive EMP, either from the sun or nuclear. They're studying it, they're assessing it. FERC did issue the rule last October, but it took NERC 5 years to come up with a standard to determine how you would cut vines and trees away from power lines. They're not the most rapidly moving forward industry in the world, though God love them if they can solve this problem. But since the EMP Commission reports have been done, there is not a utility that has taken action to protect against either solar EMP or nuclear EMP. We've heard talks about, well, satellites will warn us of an EMP solar flare, and then the president will indemnify you guys, and you'll shut the grid down. That was being proposed by Joseph Butt, and some of the people who don't want it. A lot of people think EMP is nuclear, and then they think missile defense. Then they don't want to do anything about missile defense, so they deny there's a problem.
I would ask.
We're way behind the power curve.
I was just asked. Do you have large transformers that you've actually taken and put devices on them to protect them from solar flares?
The expertise is here on this matter.
Right, but they haven't been. But none of the transformers are get protected. But you're looking into it. That's good. But as far as I know, other than Centerpoint Energy, no one's really actually started to remediate with devices, transformers.
The technology is not proven.
Let me, if I may, no, this is very important. I'm really very pleased you're here, so I appreciate specifically
let's
you
be
addressing
clear.
this. But Peter, may I just ask Peter Pry to say a word too?
The Idaho National Lab spent $2 million of your tax dollars, along with DITRA, to test the Imprimis ABB technology, and it does work. It's not true that nothing's been proven. That does protect against EMP solar, and it can be implemented.
Okay, Peter Pry.
Thank you. Michael Del Rosso has no reason to apologize. His statement that nothing has been done, sir. That is actually factually accurate. Doing studies, okay, and passing an NPOPR to theoretically look at the problem in the views of the American people is not doing anything. Even Centerpoint Technology down in Houston hasn't actually done anything to remediate. They've done investigations. They're investigating technologies. The idea that the technology is unproven is nonsense. The United Department of Defense has known for 50 years how to protect against EMP. The nuclear EMP problem is a harder one to solve than the natural EMP problem. There are Faraday cages and surge arresters and blocking devices that can be installed. We've known how to do that. I've served on the NERC's Geomagnetic Disturbance Task Force for years now and watched firsthand the dishonesty, the intellectual dishonesty going on and the games played by that organization to avoid having to do anything. We had a technical conference, back in April of last year, to examine the junk science report produced by NERC. They are so determined not to do anything that they produced a report that claimed that if a Carrington event-class geomagnetic storm, happened today, that the blackout would last hours to a day, and they would be able to recover from that, which was nonsense. Numerous studies were done by my organization as well as others, and we put this to the test in front of the FERC, and they lost the debate. That's why the NOPR went out, because NERC tried to avoid doing anything about it. So the industry is actually, well, they're approximately in the same position that the Zeppelin industry was back in the 1920s, when they were trying to convince everybody that travel by hydrogen was perfectly safe and you didn't have to worry about anything. This whole country is a great big Hindenburg being flown by the NERC right now, and we're trying to get them to switch to helium.
On that very interesting historical analogy, we're going to wrap up. Let me just say two things, if I may. First of all, please take a look at the crosstabs of the polling company's survey. It's very interesting that this is so broadly seen as a problem and something that the public have all kinds of demographic stripes wants addressed. And let me just say in closing to you, sir, I really mean it. I'm very grateful that you're here. I hope that this coalition will have an opportunity very soon and on a continuing basis to see what can be done to really move this thing along, because I don't want to say that nothing is being done. On the other hand, I don't want to leave people with the impression that anything material is being done. And the point really of this whole exercise is to say enough already with the things that aren't mitigating the danger we face. It's time to do that. And I believe that that is in the interest of the electric industry. I believe that is in the interest of the whole host of industries that absolutely critically depend upon electricity, and indeed all of the rest of us who depend upon it. And it is for that purpose that we've come together. I want to thank again this terrific panel. I'm going to close it, Hank, because I got to go testify. And I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us, especially on such short notice. We'll be, I'm sure, in touch further as this coalition and its work and the great partners that we have come even further, I hope, towards the solutions that we all need. Thank you very much.